Welcome to While We Were Distracted, the podcast where we explore topics that often get overshadowed in the rush of daily life.
Imagine you are piloting this massive commercial passenger jet, right? You've got hundreds of people on board.
Okay, stressful start, but I'm with you.
Yeah, but wait, it gets worse. When you look down at the dashboard, it doesn't actually tell you how much fuel is currently in the tanks.
Oh, wow.
It only shows you how much fuel you burned yesterday. And to make matters worse, half your flight crew is like screaming at you to speed up so you reach the destination faster.
And I'm guessing the other half is panicking.
Exactly. The other half is demanding you initiate an emergency landing right now to conserve what little fuel might be left. And nobody in the cockpit can even agree on how to read the gauges in the first place.
That sounds like an absolute nightmare.
It is. And that incredibly stressful, chaotic scenario is, well, effectively how the federal budget process operates today.
It's a terrifying analogy, but it is remarkably accurate. I mean, we tend to think of national finance as this clean, precise science, right? Executed by people in suits looking at perfectly balanced spreadsheets.
Right, like it's all just simple math.
Exactly. But the reality of federal budgeting is just far more fractured and, honestly, reactive.
Which is exactly why we are diving straight into the perennial, heavily debated, and deeply controversial pursuit of a balanced budget amendment to the U.S. Constitution.
Yes.
Welcome to this deep dive. For those of you joining us, we know you want to get smart on these complex topics without all the info overload, so we are thrilled to have you here. Today, we're pulling from two very specific, very recent sources to figure out how this all works.
So what are we looking at today?
First, we have a policy statement that was released on March 18th, 2026 by the grassroots organization Americans for Prosperity, or AFP.
Okay, got it.
And second, we're breaking down a really detailed news report titled The Deficit Divide. That one is written by Catherine Tully McManus and Mia McCarthy, and it analyzes a very recent super high-stakes vote on the House floor regarding this exact issue.
And, because federal spending, the national deficit, and taxation are just intensely partisan issues, we really need to establish our ground rules right at the COP.
Yes, definitely. Because fiscal policy is so heavily polarized, we want to make sure you, the listener, understand that our goal today is not to take a political side.
Right, no sides today.
We are not here to endorse the left-wing view, and we are not endorsing the right-wing view on the national debt. We are acting strictly as, neutral auditors.
Just looking at the facts?
Exactly. Our mission is to look under the hood of this legislation to see how the math actually works, explore the arguments driving its enduring popularity, and unpack why this latest attempt ultimately failed on the House floor.
We're dissecting the mechanics, not the politics.
Precisely. Okay, let's unpack this. To really understand why Congress spent its time voting on this measure in the first place, we first have to understand the fundamental argument that drives the balanced budget movement.
Right, the core philosophy.
Yeah. And our first source, that statement from Americans for Prosperity, lays this out to their senior policy fellow, Kurt Couchman. He argues that Washington's spending problem, and just the broader dysfunction of the budget process in general, is placed in an unsustainable burden on taxpayers and future generations.
That phrase right there, unsustainable burden, that is really the cornerstone of the movement's philosophy.
It makes sense. And, to put Couchman's argument into a relatable perspective for you, think about a small business operating on super tight margins, or just a family managing a household budget at the kitchen table.
Living paycheck to paycheck, yeah.
Right. If that family just keeps swiping a credit card indefinitely, month after month, year after year, without ever fully paying off the balance, the math eventually catches up with them.
They go bankrupt. The bank cuts them off.
Exactly. The rules of financial gravity apply to them. So the core philosophical question driving the EFP perspective is, why shouldn't the federal government have to live within its means too? If everyday Americans have to balance their books, why is the government immune to that same financial gravity?
What's fascinating here is how Couchman proposes to actually achieve this. Because, he isn't just offering a vague complaint about spending being too high.
He actually has a plan.
He has a very specific mechanical approach. Couchman is the author of a book called Fiscal Democracy in America, and in his statement, he advocates for a balanced budget amendment that balances, and I quote, over the business cycle.
Over the business cycle. So, wait. He is not saying that the ledger has to hit zero down to the exact penny every single calendar year.
No, and that is a crucial economic distinction. Balancing over the business cycle means you are looking at a much broader horizon of economic expansion and contraction.
Okay, how does that work in practice?
Well, during a boom, when the economy is red hot and tax revenues are just pouring in, the government would be legally required to run a surplus. They save money.
So they stockpile the extra cash.
Exactly. Then, during a recession, when revenues naturally drop off and the need for, social safety nets increases, the government is allowed to run a temporary deficit. The idea is that over a decade or so, the surpluses and the deficits naturally cancel each other out.
Oh, I see. It smooths out the math. But if that is the goal, why do we actually need to amend the U.S. Constitution to do it? Why can't Congress just pass a normal law saying, hey, let's save money during the good times?
Well, proponents of this view, like AFP, argue that a constitutional requirement is literally the only way to force long-term discipline.
Because Congress won't do it voluntarily.
Right. They believe lawmakers simply do not have the natural incentive to curb wasteful spending on their own. I mean, think about it. The political rewards for spending money, like bringing construction projects to a district or funding really popular programs, those rewards are immediate and highly visible.
Yeah. Get reelected.
Exactly. But the political consequences of accumulating debt, those are delayed and super abstract. Therefore, proponents argue that Congress has a broken routine habit of spending more than it collects.
So they're basically saying that Congress cannot be trusted to go on a diet on its own, so we have to legally padlock the refrigerator.
That is exactly the sentiment. Yeah, an amendment bypasses those standard legislative temptations and creates an unbreakable mandate to prioritize, responsible fiscal choices.
I get the household analogy, but I do have to push back a little bit.
Yeah.
Because economists often debate comparing a sovereign government to a household budget. A family cannot print its own currency, right?
Right, or issue treasury bonds that the entire global economy relies on.
Exactly. But setting that macroeconomic debate aside for a second, if we agree on the philosophy of living within our means, how do we actually write that into federal law? Because philosophy is one thing, but actual mathematical formulas are a whole different beast.
They really are. And let's turn to our second source, the deficit divide report, to see how that theory hits reality. We need to look at the specific mechanics of House Joint Resolution 139.
Right, that's the recent bill.
Yeah, it was sponsored by Representative Andy Biggs of Arizona.
Okay, and Biggs didn't just propose some vague rule, right? He proposed a very precise, rigid mathematical formula. Under his resolution, the total federal expenditures for a single year cannot exceed the average annual receipts, so the tax revenue collected in the 3 prior years.
And to be fair, that 3-year trailing average is adjusted for inflation and changes in the population.
Okay, but even with those adjustments, locking spending to a 3-year trailing average sounds incredibly risky.
How so?
Let me put it this way, that it's like trying to set your family's grocery budget for this year based on what you were earning 3 years ago, right before you suddenly lost your job.
I see what you mean.
If the federal budget is chained to the past 3 years' revenue, what happens if the country hits an unexpected crisis? What if there is a severe recession or, a massive natural disaster?
The revenue plummets.
Exactly. In those scenarios, tax revenue inevitably gapes because businesses are hurting and people are out of work. But simultaneously, the need for government spending absolutely spikes. You need disaster relief, unemployment benefits, economic stimulus.
The demand goes up while the supply goes down.
Yeah. So if you are legally capped by what you collected over the last 3 years, how do you respond to the emergency right in front of you?
And that tension is exactly why this debate is so fiercely contested. You are highlighting the fundamental friction between the desire for rigid fiscal discipline and the absolute necessity of macroeconomic flexibility.
It feels like a trap.
It does. And if you think that 3-year spending formula is restrictive, we have to look at another massive hurdle embedded in Biggs's resolution. And this is regarding how the government brings money in.
You mean the tax threshold?
Yes. The resolution does not just cap spending based on past revenue. It actively restricts how the government can generate new revenue.
Wait, how does it do that?
Biggs's measure would institute a requirement for a 2/3 majority vote, an actual supermajority in both the House of Representatives and the Senate, just to approve any new tax or to increase an existing tax rate.
Wait, a 2/3 majority just to raise a single tax rate?
Yes.
That is an incredibly high bar. And reading through the sources, the reporters point out a massive procedural contrast here. They mention a huge GOP megabill that passed the Senate last summer.
The tax cut bill.
Yeah. It featured significant tax cuts, and it passed with just a simple majority using the budget reconciliation process.
That is correct.
Now, for anyone listening who doesn't spend their free time reading congressional rule books, Budget reconciliation is this special procedural maneuver. Because it is tied directly to the budget, it allows the Senate to bypass the filibuster.
Right, it's a fast-track process.
So instead of needing 60 votes to advance a bill, you only need a simple majority of 51 votes. Am I getting that right?
You are. So let's look at the structural asymmetry this creates. Under the current rules, passing massive tax cuts, which technically increase the deficit if they aren't offset somewhere else, is relatively easy.
It takes just 51 votes in the Senate.
Exactly. But under this proposed amendment, if you realized the deficit was ballooning and you really wanted to raise taxes to balance the budget, you would need a supermajority. You would need 67 votes in the Senate.
Wow. That makes cutting revenue procedurally simple, but raising revenue procedurally monumental.
It's heavily weighted.
That effectively puts almost the entire burden of balancing the budget onto the spending side of the ledger. You would have to cut programs because raising taxes would be nearly impossible.
That's the practical outcome, yes.
But that raises a massive functional question about the how. Like, let's say this amendment passes. The budget is law. Halfway through the year, tax revenues come in way lower than expected, and suddenly, oops, we're violating the Constitution. What actually happens? Who enforces it? Do the Capitol Police arrest the Treasury Secretary?
That is the logistical nightmare that legal scholars always warn about with these amendments. The text rarely establishes a clear enforcement mechanism.
Nobody really knows.
Pretty much. If Congress violates the spending cap, who has the legal standing to sue? Does it go straight to the Supreme Court?
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Do we suddenly have unelected judges deciding which federal agencies get their funding slashed to balance the math? Or does it trigger some kind of automatic, across-the-board sequester where every single federal program gets cut equally, regardless of its vital importance?
It sounds like a recipe for absolute legal chaos.
It would definitely shift an enormous amount of power away from elected lawmakers and hand it directly to the judicial branch.
Okay, but lawmakers aren't oblivious. I mean, they know unpredictable emergencies happen. They know they can't just let the country collapse because of a math formula. So there has to be some kind of escape hatch built into Big's bill, right?
There is. They wrote in a specific exception for times of crisis.
And here's where it gets really interesting. Because you would assume that if the nation is under existential threat, the rules just go out the window. And the bill does state that Congress could exceed the spending limit. They could break the math formula in times of war.
It makes intuitive sense. I mean, if the country is attacked, you cannot be paralyzed by a 3-year trailing average revenue cap. You have to fund the military immediately.
Right.
But there is a massive catch embedded in the precise language of the bill.
The legal phrasing is everything.
Exactly. The bill explicitly specifies that this war exception only applies for any year in which an official declaration of war is in effect.
An official declaration. So not just a military conflict, not an authorization of the use of military force.
Right. And if we look at the historical reality detailed in the sources, that phrasing completely changes the implications of the amendment. The sources point out that modern post-World War II wars have largely been funded by debt.
That's true.
But crucially, none of them, not a single one, including the massive, decades-long global war on terror, were ever backed by an official, constitutionally defined declaration of war by Congress.
I just want to make sure I'm grasping the geopolitical scale of this. The Korean War, Vietnam, the Gulf War, Afghanistan, Iraq. None of those were officially declared wars in the strict constitutional sense.
Not a single one.
So you are saying that under this proposed amendment, the United States could not use the emergency exception to deficit spend for modern conflicts in the way it has for the last 80 years.
That is the direct implication of the text. To bypass the spending cap, Congress would be forced into a brutal binary choice.
What are the options?
Well, either you formally declare war, which carries massive, world-altering legal and diplomatic consequences under international law, or you have to figure out how to fund your entire military intervention out of your existing tightly capped budget without borrowing a single dime.
That severely restricts how the nation responds to international crises. You are essentially telling the Pentagon, hey, we need to surge troops to counter an overseas threat, but we have to cut highway funding and Medicare to pay for it unless we formally declare World War III.
It's a huge hurdle.
The threshold for intervening globally becomes astronomically high.
It is a profound restriction on both executive and legislative power. And armed with the knowledge of how incredibly strict and potentially restrictive these rules are, you know, the 3-year trailing average, the supermajority for taxes, the official declaration of war loophole, we really have to turn to how the actual vote played out on the House floor.
Right, because this actually went to a vote.
Yeah, this wasn't just a theoretical white paper. This was an actual piece of legislation voted on by lawmakers.
Well, the legislative reality was swift and brutal. The measure was rejected. The final vote was 211 to 207 against the resolution.
Pretty close, but still a loss.
Yeah, but the reporting around how it actually came to the floor is frankly fascinating. The sources share a striking behind-the-scenes detail about the bill's sponsor, Representative Andy Biggs.
Oh, this part is really interesting.
Right. Now, Biggs is known as a staunch budget hawk. He has a history of threatening to tank entirely separate, routine spending bills over their price tags. You would assume that a floor vote on his signature constitutional amendment would be the result of, like, a massive drawn-out negotiation.
A grand bargain with party leadership.
Exactly. You'd think he traded his vote on something else to get this to the floor. But Biggs admitted in an interview that GOP leaders didn't ask him for anything. They didn't offer him anything either.
Wow.
He literally said he was shocked when he got a call out of the blue saying they were finally putting his bill on the floor. And when the reporters reached out to the Speaker's office for a comment on the timing, nothing. No immediate response.
If we connect this to the bigger picture of congressional maneuvering, we really have to ask a strategic question. Why would leadership suddenly force a floor vote on a bill that, frankly, everyone in Washington knew was destined to fail?
Right. I mean, why go through the motions if the math isn't there?
Because the threshold for passing a constitutional amendment is purposefully immense. It is arguably the most difficult legislative maneuver in American governance.
It's not just a simple majority.
Not at all. First, you need a two-thirds supermajority in the House. Then you need a two-thirds supermajority in the Senate. And even if you miraculously achieve that bipartisan consensus, it still doesn't become law.
Oh, right, the states.
Exactly. It then has to be sent to the states, where it must be ratified by 3/4 of all state legislatures. That is 38 separate states that have to agree to bind the federal government's hands. The report explicitly notes that even the chair of the House Budget Committee was forecasting this exact outcome.
So they knew it would fall flat.
They absolutely knew. It was purely a symbolic measure.
A symbolic measure. So what does this all mean? If everyone in that room knew the math wouldn't work, if it's doomed to fail, why force the vote at all?
It's a great question.
Because historically, this idea never dies. The reporting highlights data from the Pew Research Center and the Library of Congress that completely blew my mind. Despite the virtually impossible odds of passage, balancing the budget is the single most popular subject for constitutional amendment proposals since 1999.
Wait, the single most popular subject out of everything?
Yes, out of everything. It peaked in the 1970s and 1980s, but even recently it remains at the top of the list. It has been offered as a proposal more than 100 times.
100 times? That's wild.
Over 100 times, lawmakers have stood up and introduced an amendment to balance the budget. And every single time it hits a wall and fails.
And that historical persistence is exactly why you, the listener, should care about a failed symbolic vote that happened on a random weekday.
Exactly. It speaks to something bigger.
It really does. Because this endless cycle of proposing and failing to pass a balanced budget amendment perfectly highlights a perpetual, unresolved tension at the very heart of American governance.
What's the tension?
Well, on one side, you have the deeply ingrained, completely rational desire for responsible, long-term fiscal planning. It is the argument made so forcefully by Americans for prosperity, the belief that the government must act like a responsible entity, that mounting debt is a moral failing, passing an unfair burden to future generations.
It taps into a very relatable, common-sense idea of living within our means.
It does. But on the exact opposite side of that tug-of-war is the absolute, unyielding necessity for the federal government to have immediate, flexible responses to modern, complex crises.
Like the emergencies we talked about.
Right. Whether that is an unprecedented economic meltdown, a global pandemic, or funding an undeclared military conflict, you cannot easily have both rigid constitutional math and total crisis flexibility.
You want the safety and discipline of a time-locked vault, but you also want to be able to grab the cash instantly if the house catches on fire.
Exactly. That's the perfect way to look at it. And the failure of HJREs 1 through 9 isn't just a story about vote counting in the House. It's a story about the American legislative system deliberately rejecting that locked vault because it ultimately fears the fire more than it fears the debt.
It really makes you think about the nature of our system.
Uh-huh.
Which leaves me with a final, somewhat provocative thought for you to mull over long after this deep dive ends.
Yeah.
We have this idea, the balanced budget amendment. It has been the single most popular constitutional amendment proposal for decades.
Over 100 attempts.
Right, it taps into a foundational desire for responsibility. Yet, it continually, predictably fails to pass. So the question is, does our incredibly slow, incredibly difficult legislative system function as a necessary protective shield against mathematically unworkable ideas that would paralyze the country in a crisis? Or does that same system act as an impenetrable barrier, permanently preventing the popular will of the people from ever actually becoming reality? Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We will catch you next time.
Don't forget to like and subscribe for the next episode on While We Were Distracted.